And we'll introduce ourselves. My name is Chris Wilson. I'm the CEO of WPA Intelligence. This is Ashlee Stephenson, who works with me, is our senior political person at WPA. And we're going to go through a presentation regarding data and its use in campaigns. For anybody who doesn't know about us as a firm, though, that might be a helpful place to start. WPA Intelligence is a company that specializes in both polling and predictive analytics. And we'll talk a little bit about the data ecosystem on both the right and the left. But we are somewhat unique on the Republican side of the aisle in that there are not really no other firms that do both of those things, the polling and the analytics part of things. My background, though, and where we've grown into this from is I served as Director of Research, Analytics, and Digital Strategy on the Cruz for President 2016 campaign. And we're running a little bit behind, so what I'm going to do is after, we're going to show you a video that Fox News did on our work on that I think sets the stage nicely. And then what I'm going to do is we're going to run through some case studies. And then after that, we want to open up to discussions because I'd like to be able to address this more specifically to what those of you who may be practitioners or want to implement this may be looking to learn, so that we're not talking just solely about a bunch of Senate races or governor's races if you guys are doing state house races or running conservative organizations. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Presumably. It says it's playing. Well, those are the benefits of not being able to test it beforehand. So apologies for that, but what we will do, if you can see, this is actually downloadable at wpaintel.com/CPAC. So in the event something like this occurred, it actually has a link to it. And what this is just John Stossel did about a 12-minute piece on the data analytics program that we put together that led to, and for any of you who don't remember, as I tell everybody who I meet and talk to incessantly about, we did win Iowa, and we won Iowa with a very sophisticated analytics program in which we took the Iowa caucus electorate, an electorate that had in 2008 been 119,000 voters, in 2012 been 124,000 voters, and in 2016 was 187,000 voters. And that growth is what allowed us, and if you look at, although Stossel shows that all of the polling leading into the caucus showed Donald Trump winning, and most of it showed Marco Rubio moving into second place. Yet we won, and we knew we were going to win because we were able to increase turnout through our use of analytics, and that's the point of the Stossel piece. So hopefully that'll, somewhat you guys, anyone who finds that interesting can watch it later. So first of all, why don't we go through some of the evolution of data and where it has grown from and to where it is today. And there's sort of this attitude that data is new in political campaigns, but it really isn't. Back in as long ago as 1890, William Jennings Bryan was compiling rudimentary data sets using index cards to track characteristics of individual supporters down to the end of that specific level. In the mid-20th century, the invention and popularity of television led them away from direct appeals to appealing to voters in a mass medium. But it became more complex as TV grew and went from 300 different from a few stations, 3 networks, to several hundred different stations. So that's what really brought about the rise of campaign polling. And the famous example of Dewey beats Truman, and then some refinements after that allowed us to do more and talk to more people. But although we find some of those same challenges re-entering into the world of polling, and we still do a lot of market research, but Pew put out a piece yesterday and talks about how in the 2018 election cycle, only 6% of respondents were reachable through telephone polling. So that creates a real challenge. Now, it really didn't have an effect on the accuracy in 2018. In fact, it was one of the most accurate cycles in history in terms of predicting elections. But you can imagine if you have only 1 in 20 people that are reachable through telephone, it is really important that analytics plays a role in any campaign, whether it is at the presidential level, but all the way down to a race for city council. And then finally, in the 1980s, we saw the beginning of political lists and databases. And if any of you are really interested in this, there's a great book called Rise of the Right about Jesse Helms and what his first run for United States Senate, in which his team began compiling databases from lists of voters and targeting them with direct mail. And they built a national direct mail fundraising list off of that. But that's really in campaigning overall. And talking about data, This was interesting. As part of Black History Month, someone showed W.E.B. Du Bois's data visualizations from the occupations of whites and African Americans in Georgia back in 1900 and using charts to illustrate that. So again, been around for a long time. From specific to campaigns in 1990s going into, moving from polling now into data, voter targeting was based on really short lists of 4 to 6 segments based on small numbers of added characteristics. Using simple statistical tools like shade, for any of you who had a lot of math in college, you probably remember that, those painful segments whenever you worked with that. But what that did is it allowed segments based on a few demographics, 3 or 4 combined, to enter into the classification of universes that were used for targeting. But this was so astronomically expensive in the 90s to be able to utilize this. To be able to buy a shade analysis of segmentation would be in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it was really only affordable by a presidential campaign. Then in 2004, the Bush campaign really made some innovations with what was known as micro-targeting. And this allowed an increase of up to, say, 20 segments. But again, it required massive amounts of data, massive computing power, and a single micro-targeting survey to be able to create these was really in the excess of $100,000. Then, in 2008, we saw the Democrats really innovate. And President Obama's data team was the first to bring what is, I would call, modern predictive analytics into politics. In fact, it was run by a guy who's a good friend of mine, Dan Porter, who built out the Obama campaign. And they did a nationwide digital campaign in which they collected massive amounts of voter data. And they were able to target people down to the bus stops they used to get to the polls. In 2012, it even grew beyond that. And Obama for America's Chicago headquarters housed the campaign analytics team, which had more than 50 data analysts that used big data to predict individual behavior of tens of millions of Americans. To put it in comparison to the Obama's 50 analysts, the Romney campaign had 6. And I would say 2014 is really when we saw the Republican data resurgence. And I give a lot of credit to those people who were at the Republican National Committee coming out of the 2012 cycle. Obama had won, Republicans had lost, and they got together and did what was called the autopsy. There's a lot of parts of that autopsy that I don't think were all that useful, but having said that, they did build out from that what is now known as the Data Trust, a private entity that would work with state parties. We'd seen state parties start to become less powerful, and I say that painfully as a former state of Texas executive director. But they allowed the PACs, campaigns, to share data between them, and it really became the hub of the GOP ecosystem. And campaigns and PACs shared donor results, scores, and even targets. Free data became common. And then you had I360, the Koch network affiliated organization that somewhat was a competitor, but it also caused some fragmentation. And then the RNC and state parties began to push all the data in together, make it available to everybody. And it's really created a system where we are able to, when we work on a Senate campaign, a governor's race, we push our data back into Data Trust and allows organizations like as diverse as the Club for Growth on the right to Conservative Leadership, Congressional Leadership Fund or Senate Leadership Fund to be able to know that we are targeting and utilizing the same set of data rather than having to everyone go out and create their own. I will quickly go through how this is done because I don't think anybody showed up here for a math class. But the fact is the reason what has made this possible is machine learning and artificial intelligence, Moore's law, the fact that we can now do far more with computer conductors and transistors than we used to be able to, and Amazon Web Services or other centralized storage systems that are far less expensive than it was in the 90s or even early 2000s whenever this began. We utilize everything from supervised algorithms to unsupervised algorithms that allow us to predict behavior. And this behavior is as vast from how people are going to turn out and vote, who they're going to vote for, what issues will motivate them to vote. And we'll give you some real examples of that here in a second. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ashlee to talk about one of the campaigns she was involved in. I think on the congressional level, it was one of the most impressive in terms of its use of data analytics in the 2018 cycle.
Thank you, Chris. And a big thing that we really want to drive home in today's conversation is just the cost of using analytics and the ability to have access to the kinds of things that will help you not only from an inoculation perspective, but of course leaning in if you're on offense, trying to win a campaign or grow your organization. And the first example that we're going to flag here is Congressman Brian Mast for Congress. We all knew heading into 2018 it could potentially be a tough election cycle as we looked at the House. And it was fascinating for us as practitioners, an extremely optimistic moment for us to have the opportunity to work with good conservative Republican campaigns to see those that are going to use a lot of these tools that aren't new, but now much more easily available, not cost prohibitive, in something that we can deploy because of the evolution, all the things that Chris was just talking about. Congressman Mast is in Florida's 18th district. He's down along the coast. He is a platinum example of a campaign that thought, look, 2018, we don't know what it's going to bring, but we're going to do everything that we can to prepare to inoculate and build a force of nature. And they used data at the very outset of this cycle to begin to build some audiences through whom they could communicate with at the individual level on digital, doors, text messaging. We're going to get to a couple of different tactics, frankly, all of them, in a campaign that you can use data for. We built the first set of models for Congressman Mast in February of 2018. So hard to believe as we sit in the off year now, so many campaigns, frankly, are getting started today, building their models for 2020. That was considered early in 2018. We do believe that 2020, everything's going to start earlier, and it already is. So they got out ahead of this. They built their first model, and it was what we call a candidate consider model. This is something that is directly applicable for any organization. If you have, if you're a conservative outfit that has a message, what we call a consider is going and finding people who might be open to what it is you're trying to do, sell, or persuade people to support. In this case, since the Florida primary is in August, Congressman Mast didn't have an opponent yet. So we built a consider model for him, which essentially means finding every individual who might consider voting for the congressman and start to move them into the bank. The hard red on the right, that indicates high likely to vote, high propensity to turn out and vote, also likely to consider supporting Congressman Mast. The campaign immediately started working those people over, making sure that they were with us. That's essentially our base. We know in this environment, we can't leave anything up to chance. They started working early on the base. And then as you look at this data visualization, the orange are the people who are your lean supporters. So if you have an organization that you have an issue set that you want to go find people that might support you and you want to grow beyond your base, you begin to look to those individuals who might have a propensity to be there and build a plan to ultimately go and get them and, you know, bring them home, as we call them. And in 2018, one of the really fun stories, we were saying as those who work in the data science space, it was going to be a turnout election. And we saw that it was, you know, a 100-year flood, black swan event. There's a number of different nomenclature for it. Turnout was going to be off the charts. So for our clients that we had the opportunity to work with on the data side, we went and figured out to the individual level, who are those that might support us, but aren't going to necessarily be with us. And this was just so critical in 2018, as we know the left was galvanized from day one after President Trump was elected, to make sure that our campaigns and our good conservative candidates knew who those individuals were, that they had to turn out. And as most of you probably know, working in politics or volunteering, turnout is always a more difficult thing. It's more time intensive. You have to start early having those conversations. So this is really an excellent case study of a campaign that knew not only did we have to solidify our base, but let's go find those people that we know would vote for us and start working them through the process early. And I'm just going to quickly get through the rest of these slides. What we also did for this campaign was build a couple custom message models, which means we figured out where we might have a potential soft spot on some messages that would be advantageous to the congressman, to also looking at the flip side. Who are the people that might not potentially love what the Democrats have to offer? And eventually down the line, as we did have an opponent after August, we built some custom message models to figure out what is it that we needed to be saying essentially, and to who. And that's how predictive analytics just helps the sophistication of every tactic that you're going to take. Now when you go to the doors, it's much easier to know what to say to somebody to make sure that door doesn't shut on you, which is one of the things, you know, the Leadership Institute teaches time and time again. When you're making telephone calls, those are the kinds of things that big data now helps inform. So we're not just guessing and assuming people want to talk about border security, you know, healthcare, you name it. Now we know at the individual level.
Anybody here from Oklahoma? No? Well, this was a race that I'd love to be able to talk about with somebody who lived through it, but I actually live in Oklahoma City, believe it or not. I commute back and forth to D.C. But we ended up, I talked to Kevin Stitt about this time in 2017. And he was a businessman who ran a mortgage company out of Tulsa. He had never been involved in politics, as we ultimately found out as we began to look more into our client's record. He hadn't voted before either, so that was kind of unique and interesting. But he was interested in politics. Just, you know, he's building a company. He started, as he liked to say, he started this mortgage company with $1,000 and a computer, and he grew it into several thousand employees, tens of thousands of employees in a billion-dollar company. He got into the race against the sitting lieutenant governor and the sitting mayor of Oklahoma City. And so as we began this race, and he had actually reached out, he was a data guy, and he'd reached out to me, not even knowing that I lived in Oklahoma City, and reached out to me because it was one of those deals where everyone told him he had no shot at all. We began the campaign by building exactly what Ashlee said, a consideration model, but the other aspect of it was we wanted to build a ground game. And this is, Ashlee kind of mentioned a second ago, but completely applicable whether you are with a political organization or a group. And as you can see here, we built a model of Stitt voters. There were only 4,098 of them at the time. And then we built a model of activists. And we overlaid the two, that's just simple Venn diagrams. We found 1,026 people who were Stitt supporters and were activists. And there's 77 counties in Oklahoma. Sadly, there was not one of those in every county, but we have found a lot of them there. And this is exactly the same way. The Cruz campaign in Iowa was the first campaign with 99 county chairmen. That's kind of a big deal there. It always gets national news whenever you announce that, so you always want to be the first one to announce it. And we wanted to do the same thing in Oklahoma. So we did that. We also built out the same kind of model Ashlee talked about. But what's unique about this situation is because there were multiple candidates, you couldn't have your simple overlay. And I'm only showing 3 candidates here. We also had a former U.S. attorney, we had state senators, things like that. And our first model, we built out this consideration. So you will find someone who would consider your candidate. For any of you who've seen polling before, you've seen a descriptive ballot where you describe and you say, Chris Wilson, 50-year-old male who has done X, Y, and Z. And you might even say the name. I mean, you just want to find people who say they would consider voting for you. That is how we built these out initially. And so our likely Stitt universe was about 15,000. Our likely Cornett was about 21. The sitting lieutenant governor, Lamb, was about 16%. But those were all just considerations when they had to make a decision between the two. But to break this stalemate, because we needed to start to merge from that group, did the same thing Ashlee talked about they did for Congressman Mast, in which we began to split the universe and the voting public into issues. Oppose tax increases, balance the budget, want a conservative political outsider. In the end, we only made the runoff by 0.55%. The way that we did that, though, was by being able to target those people we knew were considering both. Mick Cornett was the mayor of Oklahoma City, had a strong base there in that central urban area. So we had to go compete with the lieutenant governor in rural areas where we were targeted each of those voters on specific issues of interest to them. And it's how we made the runoff. Then we made the runoff against Mick Cornett. It all became ideological in its purpose because Cornett had come out against Donald Trump and come out against the wall. And so we were able to build some strong ideological differences there. But the initial findings we had to go pick up all of those Lamb voters immediately. We already knew who they were and what issues were important to them. And the day after the primary, while the Cornett campaign was looking to go spend a ton of money on TV or go drop direct mail to all of them, we started targeting them that next day with digital advertising based on the issues of importance to them. It's what allowed us to emerge, and we won the runoff going away pretty handily. Then finally, I'm going to go to the general election. We were running against a Democrat former attorney general. Like every Democrat, he called himself, well, not every Democrat anymore. AOC is making sure that she's pushing the party to the left and doing us all a favor. But Edmondson wanted to define himself as a conservative. And because we had moved, as the media likes to say, oh, you moved so far to the right during the primary, and we'd taken some strong stands on issues, but that's where Kevin was. It's the kind of candidate I work for, not surprisingly. We needed to identify specific segments, know who those voters were, and kind of like Ashlee talked about a little bit ago, knowing it was going to be a turnout election, we had to make sure we were communicating to them directly. And so we identified those people who thought the state was on the wrong track. We had a Republican governor, but even though it's a Republican state, she was the most unpopular governor in America at that time by any sort of national polling that would come out. I mean, she was always like a 15 fave, around 80 unfave. I mean, it was really remarkable. And so the Democrat National Committee and the Democrat Governors Association saw this as a prime target and really dumped a lot of money in Oklahoma, which you wouldn't have expected. So we had to instill our early universe. There was no silver bullet, and we had to split people up. We had to know those people that thought the state was on the wrong track and convince them that Kevin Stitt was the person to put them on the right track. We need to find Trump approvals. That's on the second box down. And make sure that they understood that Kevin Stitt had the same value set as Donald Trump. We had to find those people that we put out a budget plan. And it was more really just about balancing the budget, undoing some of the things that Fallon had done. We had to find those voters. You can see we found all of these different people who fell into these universes. And those that were in the lean Edmondson universe, or this one over here, which I again believe it was the most important universe in every race we're involved in 2018. And I'll talk a little bit about the Ted Cruz Better O'Rourke race in a second on this, from this category. But those turnout targets mattered so much, and for us to be able to identify them and pull them out, but also to make sure that we kept our voters at home. And so on Election Day, we ended up winning 54-42 after the Democrat National Committee came and dumped a lot of money in trying to win a Republican state. So it was, we're still doing victory laps around Oklahoma City on both the primary and the general on that, and we've got a governor there now in the state that I live in that I'm pretty proud of. So I'll let Ashlee talk about Georgia.
Sure, and our last case study is about Georgia. Like Oklahoma, you have to win 3 times to end up ultimately winning the race, but I would argue that in Georgia, the general election is pretty much as hard as the primary and then the runoff. So this is a really great case study of how analytics can take a campaign starting at a certain place and ultimately skyrocketing to the end. And as we'll look back on Georgia through the national media lenses, certainly had an incredibly formidable candidate with Stacey Abrams. Oprah went in and campaigned for her, which was, frankly, regardless of partisanship, kind of neat to see. And then she ended up giving the response to the State of the Union. So really, what I think the left considers to be a rock star future of the party came out of this race. But we are, of course, very proud and thankful to have had the opportunity to work with now Governor Kemp. Much like the Stitt story, we started out in a place that, many folks didn't think he was not only going to not make the runoff, certainly not have a chance to defeat Casey Cagle in that opportunity. We built turnout model being most important, figure out who's going to participate in the primary, and when you have a turnout and a primary and then a runoff, it's a little bit more difficult. Those numbers change significantly. So we started from scratch. Who was going to participate, made sure all of our time and attention was focused solely on those, because as you know, in a campaign, you can't afford to waste a penny or time. Those are things you can never get back. So we focused all of our efforts for getting through step 1, did this geographically. What this does is allow you to see through the lens of this is just at the county level, and we go down to precinct by precinct, how many people are going to participate, what does the turnout gap look like in a presidential turnout year versus an off year, which is an also really exciting and interesting part of the conversation about Georgia, where turnout was very high, much like the rest of the country in 2018 when we think about it through the lens of a midterm versus a presidential. Second, this is again just a visualization of that candidate consideration model. We had a long way to grow in order to build now Governor Kemp's name identification. Who are those that were likely to consider voting for us? We knew to the individual level, when you pair it with the turnout, who are those folks that we need to go start talking to? And then much like Stitt, in the runoff, we were really quick. We had to pivot immediately to figure out who are those folks that maybe participate in the primary, what does the runoff turnout look like, and make sure that we turned all of our time and attention only communicating with voters that were going to participate in that runoff. You don't want to waste any money, and you know that that pivot is very difficult. It's just like a late primary when we look at a New Hampshire or Florida or places, Arizona. You got to be able to turn the page fast. Predictive analytics allows you to almost immediately, once you get through the machine learning, to refocus all of your efforts, turning the page to the next endeavor. And here too is just a quick visualization where we have the Kemp voters versus Cagle. So what this allows us to do, I like to equate it to the old precinct targeting that we used to do in the early 2000s. We'd figure out when you're door knocking, who are the sleeping giants that we don't want to let know that you're out there. As you look at this, we now can score who are the people that are going to be with our opponent. Even though in this case they are Republicans, we don't spend any time or money talking to them. It's those middle audiences and the turnout targets that you focus all your time on. So this goes back to 1890 or whatever our first example is. It's just like traditional campaigning, now in a much more focused manner. Let's see here, I think I missed one. And then we get into the general election. We all know what happened there. Ultimately ended up being really close. What I think is fascinating is we built our first turnout model in August. We already saw the participation was going to be about 600,000 raw votes higher than what it was in the last midterm cycle. So this is where predictive analytics really going back to that turnout conversation that's going to be so critical for 2020 as we continue to see people participating at levels like we're frankly unused to. It's just critical for any sophisticated campaign because we cannot afford to not touch those people who might be with us. But if you don't communicate with them because it doesn't look like a regular midterm voter, you might not end up in the space that Governor Kemp ultimately did at the end of the day. And this is just another build on, I don't want to spend too much time on it, like Chris mentioned, thinking about different issue sets and creating customized messaging for all these individuals that we know might be persuaded about something our opponent believes in or has said versus our candidate. It just allows us on the creative side of campaigns. We no longer just put together 30-second television ads and call it good and make sure that the mail and the phones and everything reflects it. That's really the old way of doing things. Now we know to the individual audiences who we should be saying, what we should be saying, and to who. And then finally, this is just the last slide. It's where we talked about turnout, and again, just another visualization. We had 1.3 likely Kemp voters who were with us when we built the turnout model or the ballot model, 1.2 likely Abrams. What is really interesting is when we look into the middle, and one of the very fascinating conversations that we've seen the evolution of swing voters are getting smaller and smaller. When we used to create these custom models, we always had what we called a swing audience. Frankly, we've moved away from doing that because the numbers are becoming so much smaller at the end of the day who decides elections. We know that it's critical that those who are leaning toward us, you see we have a light raw advantage by 100,000. That orange is where we really needed to focus as a campaign, our time and attention, the people that are leaning our way but on the fence if we don't really work them, and then of course the turnout targets. Those are the people that we know we've got to get to the polls no matter what it takes because enthusiasm on the left was just off the charts.
So one of the other points I'll make out of that, because I do, it was fun as we sort of got into the race against Stacey Abrams, is she really felt like, or the Democrat National Committee felt like, because Georgia has unique rules that allow, if you don't get 50% plus one in even the general election, you can go to another runoff, because you can see there was another candidate that in Metz. And so from that, you see our numbers, we didn't have a lot of room for error there. Well, not a lot of margin, but 50.22 was the difference between Governor Kemp and potentially remember Georgia 6, where there was $30 million dumped in just one congressional seat. You can only imagine how much there would have been dumped into that race. I'm going to really quickly go through how we do this a little bit deeper and talk about what the future is for you guys. But look, internet use is ubiquitous amongst all age groups. Facebook, 68% now use it, and it increases on a regular basis with seniors. Specifically how it governs a modern campaign, I think, is what I'd like to do, and then open it up to questions. The turnout model is correct, and Ashlee's addressed this a lot, and the sampling of the polling is going to be correct, and that is, the numbers on that Georgia race, or that 50.22, the difference between that and 49.99, again, is a multi-million-dollar decision, if not $100 million decision, and to make sure you get that right is so important. So what we do when we build out these universes, this is actually from the North Dakota Senate race where we did Kevin Cramer's work, believe it or not. And so you see that split into a turnout score and a Senate ballot. So there on the 0-0 side is Heidi Heitkamp. On the 1 side is Kevin Cramer. And then the likelihood to turn out from 0 to 1. So you can see there was 5,838 people who are definitely going to go over for Heitkamp, unless, they died on the way to the polls or something. And then 5,092, same story on us. Our race in 2018 in every race, and I'll bring this down to, in Texas I did work for both Governor Abbott and Senator Cruz. Anybody here from Texas? No? One person, all right. Well, you probably lived through it a little bit and saw it in the fact that at the end, Beto O'Rourke had 900 field reps. Every piece of political literature ever done shows that the most effective way to get a person into the polls is a field organization. And our ability to win in Texas was dictated by the fact that Governor Abbott and ultimately Senator Cruz were targeting these people that were below a 0.5 likelihood to turn out, but above a 0.75 likely to vote Republican. And had we not done that, because the first turnout model in Texas was 5.8 million people, the last one was 7.8, and it ultimately ended up being 8.3, which was the highest turnout ever in a midterm election. Now, we began an overall program of optimizing Texas. It's a big state. 254 counties, 9,820 precincts, 28 million people, 15.6 million registered voters, and like I said, 8.3 million people ended up voting, which was the highest ever in the history of midterm elections. So what we did is for the Abbott campaign, we optimized the field program. Because even though we'll talk a lot about TV, we'll talk about digital, the case is, had we not had this field program in which we had a series of 125 field reps that were going to go out and have contiguous areas with similar targets, but we had to break that down based on time zones. If they were only going to be there for 3 months, they couldn't have as many targets as somebody who was going to be there for 6 months. And so this just shows how granular we got even in a city like Austin, where we helped the location Our plan was for 180 field operatives. I said 125 earlier because we couldn't find that many. It just was the challenge that we had for both Abbott's campaign and Cruz's campaign was finding as many people on the right who were as excited about the race as O'Rourke was able to find on the left. Remember what I said? He had 900. Now, fortunately, they didn't use a data-driven campaign, and they just went and knocked on everybody's door. So what we showed is the O'Rourke campaign left up their field program after Election Day, and they continued to publish how many people, where their field reps were, and where they knocked on doors. So we built a scraping utility, pulled down all of the data, and went back and looked. And fortunately, he turned out a lot of our voters as well. And, or not fortunately or unfortunately, but it ended up helping us as much. And, Ted only won by 300,000 votes. It got much closer than it really should have. You can also use data for the purposes of TV targeting. There are a few firms out there that do this, but this can be, as TV is the most expensive medium still in campaigns. It's still very effective. We test it every year because campaigns want to hear that they don't have to use it. And y'all may have seen that Priorities USA, which is Obama's super PAC, Patrick McHugh, who runs it, put out a statement earlier, I guess it was right after the first year, that said for 2020, they're doing no TV. They're doing all digital. They're going to spend every dime. Now, I think that's more of a head fake than a true declaration of their strategy. But I do know that this methodology of targeting television, which was really kind of pioneered by Carol Davidson on the Obama campaign. She now works for Comcast, fortunately, and took what she built for Obama and sells it to everybody. The Trump campaign used it in 2016, interestingly enough, and the Clinton campaign did not. Carol Davidson's own invention. And it was because the Clinton campaign had a bunch of people in their data department that wanted to be the next Carol Davidson. She obviously made a lot of money building this out. So they all had these ideas that they were going to build out for the Clinton campaign that was definitely going to be president, and they would then go sell it afterwards. And they didn't use the advice that was given to them by Facebook or by Twitter or by Snapchat or by Carol at Comcast. And you can find quotes from her saying it really disturbed her because the Trump campaign was using what she built so effectively, whereas the Clinton campaign said, no, we don't need your help. But data-driven audiences and the ability to target them, again, you can pull this down, so I'm not going to read it to you because we're running a little bit on time and I don't want to keep you late since we got started late. But the other aspect of this, and this is, I think, from a usability standpoint as you get into it, is we find, and I'm sure all of you have worked on campaigns or for organizations kind of know this intuitively, is how much creative matters. Because you can go test an ad in a political survey, and you can find that it says it's going to move voters overwhelmingly, and you run statistical tests, and it should work, and you put it up in the air, and it doesn't work. And it just is because the creativity behind these things matters so much. So these are some ads we were testing in Texas, that we were able to take the data from the TV targeting. So for instance, if we ran an ad targeted toward Ashlee, and I built a score for her on Monday, and she saw this ad on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, because I'm seeing that back, then I rescore the file for her on Friday, and she moved, then I know that that feeds into this regression analysis. It tells me how much she moved. And if I'm doing that, for instance, in Texas, for 15.6 million registered voters, and at that point probably 7.5 million that say they're going to turn out, I get a lot of data on the ads. And it's really fascinating because you can look specifically like what the effect is. And the zero effect is exactly what you think. That means it's not moving anybody. So completely ridiculous. I won't say who ran that ad, but it was not moving voters at all. However, Texans Are, which is a super PAC, No Border was moving voters a lot, but there was a large margin of error on that. So some it moved a hell of a lot, and some not so much at all. And then the Beto ads, that's a great thing about, he made these ads with his iPhone, basically like Facebook Live videos. And had he run an effective campaign with ads that worked, who knows what he could have accomplished. But he didn't, and his ads sucked, so to use that statistical term. Some of the other uses of data, though, and I'm going to stop with this and kind of open it up to questions or specific examples. But door to door, you can see there on the left, being able to target out and know exactly whose door to knock on, and frankly, those who you shouldn't knock on. Remember all those scatter plots that Ashlee and I showed you. You want to knock on your turnout targets, you want to knock on your swing universe. But if somebody's already a 10 likely to vote for you and a 10 likely to turn out, do you really need to spend 10 minutes at their door talking to them? Because they're going to want to talk politics all day long. I mean, that'd be like going up and talking to my grandma. You've just lost half your day. You really want to go to those turnout targets. Digital, the ability to target people directly, and this becomes more and more effective every single year. We test this, we run regressions against it. Those same sort of tests you saw with television, we're doing on the digital side too. And it's why Priorities USA made the announcement they did. I don't think it's all a head fake. I think a lot of it, they'll probably put a big part of their budget into it because you can know, and this is hard to do, and there's not many firms that can do it. And a lot of firms will tell you they can, but they don't. So you need to check this if you're working with campaigns. But if I say I want to target Ashlee Stephenson online, I want to target her. I don't want to target someone who looks like her. And that's the key thing of digital advertising. Direct mail, you can obviously mail something to someone, you can phone them, you can text them. For our one person who lives in Texas, I guess he left, but you would know, you probably read about this. The Better Reward campaign texted everybody in Texas multiple times, annoyed the shit out of them. And it was just like people were ready to file restraining orders against the O'Rourke campaign. Ted made the comment, yeah, he's texted me 3 times. The first 2 I said no, and by the third I was undecided. It's like, it's kind of starting to convince me. And then get out the vote. And there's a lot that can be done around get out the vote. And I feel like we Republicans do not take advantage of the get out the vote efforts as much as Democrats do, particularly using some of the statistically tested and academically tested things like social pressure. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and just skip the last section because how parties are using data in 2020, I've kind of fed into the rest of it. And let's see if there's any questions from anybody so we can address specific comments. You've had your hand up like 3 or 4 times. Go ahead, yeah. Uh-huh.
I'm just curious about what they're, maybe this is subjective, but what they're doing wrong in Virginia and what they're doing wrong in like a state like Colorado.
You know, I hate to address what people aren't doing wrong, but I do think, as I started out, in the 90s, where many of us began in politics, doing the kind of work that we're talking about, the shade analysis type work, was hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy. And you couldn't even do it yourself to buy those data. In the 2000s, it was still in the tens of thousands, and often as much as 100,000 in terms of doing this. Because we had 2 presidential campaigns in 2008 and 2012 that didn't really do a lot on the data side. And then in 2016, the Trump campaign didn't do a lot of it, and then that was done. He received a lot of criticism over. I think it has caused us to be less implementative of analytics for the reasons, okay, I think it might cost too much. 2, I don't know who does it. And I'll show you one chart here I think it's kind of interesting. There's a guy named Daniel Kreese, who is a professor at UNC Chapel Hill, who did a study of data on the left. And again, you can download this, there's no way to write it down, but you can see how many firms there are on the left that do data and analytics. And those grew out of all the different campaigns in 2008. And Obama didn't have a primary challenge in 2012. And then you had in 16, the Sanders campaign did a lot in the area of online fundraising. So that's the left. Now, on the right, we have 5 or 6 firms. You have a couple that grew out of the Romney campaign that are very, very good in Deep Root, Targeted Victory, Echelon was there. And then you have Data Trust that we all kind of work with. And then you have us. I mean, it's just a much smaller group of companies that do this on the right. And I would say some of that also comes with, I mean, the left has, if I went back to those slides, I bet half of those receive VC money out of Silicon Valley. There is a lot more support for them on the left. And I think that's probably one of the things that is fed to it. So in terms of what we're doing right or doing wrong, I think the fact is we're not doing anything wrong. I mean, I can tell you for Wyoming, we did a lot of data analytics for Liz Cheney's campaign. Not necessarily for the purpose of targeting, but more for her to know where to go spend her time because, as you know, Wyoming's a big state with a sparse population basis. And so from that standpoint, I think when we use it, every company up there, if anyone called me and said, hey, how are they? They all do very good work. There's just not as many of them. And my bet is those of you who've been in politics for a while have probably never heard of half of them. You probably hadn't heard of us before today. So let me go over here. Yes, ma'am.
So Maryland just passed the law
Why don't you do this one?
for same-day voter registration. How do you take that into account?
That's actually a great question, and it's exciting, have people coming to us say, how do we use predictive analytics to build a model for same-day voter registration? It's something, frankly, just to Chris's point earlier, as we look not only the ecosystem, the fewer companies that offer these kinds of services, the willingness to be able to adopt it at a national level. It's expensive, it's time, and it's really labor intensive to do same-day voter registration. Looking forward into 2020, we've already been in some conversations with a couple of different organizations who are saying, hey, the left is doing this, it's working for them on same-day voter registration, what would it cost for us to do it? So I would just say, frankly, we've been in a vacuum in a lot of places. There are some great efforts just on voter registration in general, but it's something that we've seen through the years, frankly, through OFA for a long time, really working it on the ground. So I'm hopeful I will be doing the first predictive analytics project out of our firm for same-day voter registration in at least 1 or 2 states. We're talking about it now.
And I'll tell you we did in the Kramer campaign. Anybody here from North Dakota? Well, North Dakota is unique in the fact that they don't have voter registration. So everybody just shows up and votes. And that universe I showed you, that literally had every single adult in the state of North Dakota over 18. And so we don't have the ability to target based on voter, on that key component. You know, the one thing I've left out is in terms of how we do this and why it is also even better than what we had from them. I don't call what we do micro-targeting, which is what the terminology was in the 2000s. Because our ability, it's really direct targeting now because we have so many thousands of pieces of data on every single person, 90% of voters. I mean, there's still some people who are truly off the grid, but each one of you, as you walk in and out and scan here, I mean, think about how many times a day something specific to you is scanned and those data becoming accessible to some universe or some person somewhere who finds that valuable and the ability to build a message specifically to you. Any other questions? Let me go back here. Yes, ma'am, in the white.
So you talked a lot about the importance of a solid, vote-like liquid model.
Mm-hmm.
But looking at I360's vote propensity and on the yard sequence out, you never see more than like a 70% accuracy on actual.
I think that depends on the timing of it. I would argue there's a lot of states where we did in which we were within a few hundred, if not 1,000 votes of what ultimately happened on Election Day. And so it's a lot like if some of the things that you see when you work with I360 or Data Trust, depending on your state, the state that you're in, I think Data Trust did 27 of the 50 states last year. So of those other 23, and I may be right, somewhere in that range, those other 23 is just a national model that's built out. So if you're working from a national model, that's better than nothing, but you're so much better off having something custom done for your campaign. And if you're working, I mean, you bring up Virginia, it would be not quite prohibitively expensive. I will tell you there's a lot of state rep campaigns that we work with directly, but to do one model for one, but there's no reason why you couldn't do 4 or 5 races together and build a model out from those, particularly if they are geographically contiguous or homogeneous in their makeup, demographically homogeneous. And so from that standpoint, I think it's real key that you're not making decisions based on a national model from a turnout perspective, and at the least, at best, or at least you're working from a state model. And the next, that you're getting one that's updated close to the election. As I said, if I were to show you the turnout model we built in Texas that started at 5.8 and just kind of kept ticking up until it was a straight line until it reached 8.3 million. That 5.8 model was exactly right the day that we built it. But that was before Better O'Rourke had 900 field reps, and before the Abbott 125 field reps had gone out and knocked on doors, and those sort of things. So it's just like you wouldn't do a survey in August and say, oh, I'm at 51%, we're done, shut down the headquarters and close up and just wait for Election Day. You keep running a campaign. I feel like sometimes the analytics are looked at a little bit differently than that. You need to understand that things do evolve over time, and you have the ability to evolve them.
So do you have tips for improving our own models? Like, can we get a little input at your feature set?
Our feature set. That is, I would let you talk to one of our data scientists. You probably have to pry it out of them in terms of what we do. And it's an evolving process over time, too. As the election changes, I mean, you look at what happened in 2018 as a perfect example. It was the highest turnout since 1914 and for an off year. And from a standpoint, I mean, that truly is a black swan event. The challenge with mathematics is it's impossible to build a predictive model that can predict something that never happened before. So I think those things are, if I were to give you one today, it would look nothing like what our predictive models and the code behind it will look like in 6 months or a year or 16 months. And if it does, you should fire us that day. Yeah. I want to go to the last slide, and I'm going to talk about 2020, and then I'll stay and answer as many questions until they throw us out. But this, to me, is probably the most important number for any of you who are involved in elections in 2020. And it's what I call the sleeping giant. And if you look at these percentage voting versus not voting, there's a lot of synchronous data amongst them. But the one that shows the greatest degree of impact is high school or less voters. And if you look at the percentage voting, look at advanced degrees, 80%. Look at bachelor's degrees, 74. Some college, 63. But look at those 47% high school or less. 58 million of them did not vote in 2018, and 53 million of them didn't vote in 2016. That is, I hear so much conversation about the growing or the challenges that Republicans have with suburbs. We do, and we need to fix it, don't get me wrong. Or the challenges that exist with Hispanics. We do, we need to fix it. Although I'll point out that Governor Abbott got 44% of the Hispanic vote because we concentrate on it. These are solvable problems. As we have talked continuously about the turnout targets and the need to target those, I will tell you, if you do nothing else, you take nothing else from this seminar, or this, whatever it's called, you remember that high school or less, no matter whether you're doing a state rep race in Virginia or you're doing a congressional race out in Washington State, that is the one universe that is left at the table and not targeted by most campaigns. And that's the key, I believe, to President Trump being reelected and to us taking back the House and maintain the Senate in 2020. So that's, I'll end the remarks, and I'll go back, I'll continue Q&A until they throw us out. So yeah, go ahead.
So with the 18 to 29-year-old gaps, are you seeing a switch again? Because with me being younger and stuff, I feel like I'm 19 years old. Our group doesn't feel the same as far as 20-year-olds even, or 23-year-olds and stuff. Do you see in your data that you've been pressing so far, at least recently?
Why don't you talk about it?
Is it going more right now?
One of the things that we're really looking at
Sorry.
is, as we look at high school or less, it comes down to income. That's the way I would start to think about it. And it used to be when we were doing survey work, if I needed to cut a question, because surveys are priced based on, frankly, the number of interviews you do, cell phones, and how many questions you ask, for a long time we would often just slice out income. We'd say we have education that tells us about socioeconomics and what we need to know of where the electorate is. It is those 18 to 24, high school or less, but are making $75,000 or more that we're seeing in trends, are happy with the economy and happy with how things are going. So to your point, looking on the margins of 19 to 23, I think that's where income really comes into play, to see that the gaps that people are able to make, particularly with things like college technical education, CTE degrees that are really on the rise right now. We're getting a lot of support for that kind of policy from the former Republican-led House and the president and things like that. It's that group, when you bring in income into it, that we're seeing better numbers for conservatives, those who are making more than $75,000 annual. Yes?
So a lot of what you're talking about seems to just be massive in scale, right? You're doing this in multiple states. Do you guys handle everything in-house, or is there also a support network in individual states that you're able to partner with to actually make this a reality?
Sure. So to build the actual models itself through data collection, that's something that we just handle in-house. What you do, the mechanics of it, is go out and collect what we call a training set, or essentially observations. To some, it looks like a traditional survey, but they're really short, like 5 or 6 questions. And to get a training set, you want to get as many observations as we can. And a great point Chris made earlier about Pew, the report that came out, the amount of struggles that we're having as pollsters to get people on the phone. We used to collect observations just on the phone. We have a ton of projects right now where we're doing it through mixed methodology, which means phone calls, online, digital. Phone calls, online, some live calls to cell phones, things like that. A different blend. We might start to bring text message into it, but we don't need to technically work with partners on the ground. It's something that you do just like traditional survey work.
The high school and less, is that mirrored in registration numbers, or is there a gap there that's different than what you would see?
It's mirrored in registration numbers. I'll tell you what, if you guys are interested in learning more about this, Mark Penn's new book, it's called Microtrends Squared, I believe. He's got a couple of chapters on this, and he makes the same argument in there. And it's worth picking up, because he's got advice on how to appeal to them in terms of some slicing of the data.
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I was wondering, I'd like to hear anything you have to say about ballot harvesting in Orange County, and how you go about using predictive analytics to run a ballot harvesting operation. My understanding is we didn't do anything, and the Democrats did, and that's why we got crushed.
Yeah, well, I think that's probably accurate. I think data is the perfect way to deal with that. And I'll tell you, not that you're implying this, but I've been asked about this several times. I've spoken since that occurred. And it's like, look, they changed the law. And it's almost like a coach who said they changed the three-point line. He's like, well, I don't believe the three-point line is right, so I'm just not going to ever shoot a three-pointer. It's like, that's the rules now. You got to play by it. And the Democrats did, and they did it better than we did. And so we need to learn from that in 2018. And the thing is, when we're losing these congressional races in Orange County, they're voting down a minimum wage initiative. They're voting down a rent control initiative. So they're still conservatives. We just ran crappy campaigns. Sorry, I get passionate about that. But it's like when you change the rules, you play by the rules. You don't whine about the rules.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank
That's
you.
what I say all the time. Hi, thank you guys so very much
We'll
for
come talk to you.
watching.